everyone. As you may have known that I studied for my PhD study under the supervision of Professor Ken Hannon, who gave a talk days ago as one of the seminar series. So I'm really honored to join this series talk and after him, and I feel quite nervous and honored to give this talk. And over the years, I have been researching under Professor Hannon's influence is to look at the disciplinary interaction in academic discourse, the social interaction in disciplinary writing, and we consider how we can use this knowledge in the service of our EAP instruction and EAP teaching. And Professor Hannon has pointed out higher education, internationalized higher education, knowledge building, and reputation building are the three major forces that can help us to understand the importance of EAP education and EAP teaching. So it is important to learn how to communicate in English in a way to gain academic success nowadays. So it's very important for many undergraduate students and also for our research postgrad students and researchers, because their careers are increasingly tied to a capacity to publish in international journals. So EAP is both a gatekeeper and a gateway for many students and academics, because they have to gain fluency in using EAP to understand their disciplines, to establish their careers, and to successfully navigate their learning. And one of the goals of EAP education is to support this process and to bridge the gap of discursive practice between students or novice writers and expert writers. And in this research, my collaborator, Professor Jiang Wang, and I looked at the differences of discursive practice between novice and expert writers across pure and applied hard disciplines. And we believe this kind of linguistic knowledge can help us to understand the differences between students writing and expert writing, and we may draw on this linguistic knowledge to organize our EAP instruction. Because previous studies are mainly concerned with the differences of discursive practice between novice and expert writers in terms of a broad knowledge field, not attended to subtle disciplinary difference. So we think our research may suggest something for us to understand the differences between students writing and expert writing, and to help us to organize to better serve students in our EAP education. And I will present this research in terms of four aspects: the epistemic positioning we focus on in our linguistic analysis, and the corpus data and analysis that we use in the study, and the results we found in the data analysis, and what we could arrive at and bring to our EAP classroom based on what we have seen in this study. So part one, epistemic positioning and academic persuasion. So successful research writers construct a text by conveying a point of view towards what they discuss while anticipating readers' imagined response to the authorial voice. So it is important for the writers not only to identify an important knowledge gap, but also to present research claims and findings in a way that readers find plausible and persuasive. So a competent authorial identity is established by writers taking a personal stance on knowledge, but have also to balance the extent of authorial voice against the convictions and expectations of their disciplinary readers. And the means by which writers step into their text to offer interpretations of their data have been described using different terms, including evaluation, stance, appraisal, and meta-discourse. These terms, I think, help us to concretize the discursive resources that writers draw on in the participation of a disciplinary conversation. And these terms can also help us to see the language options in which writers align with one particular community or discipline rather than another. And Professor Hannon summarizes these different resources and the performance of self by authors as positioning, which concerns adopting a point of view both to the issues discussed in the text and to others who hold points of view on those issues. And the authorial positioning relates to the shaping of disciplinary identity of academic writers. So a number of studies have also examined the differences in authorial positioning between novice and expert writers. For example, Highland and Crossway, Cheng and Jiang, we look at the diverging linguistic forms of rhetorical choices used by writers of different professional status. And one example, which is very influential, given by Professor Highland, he compared students' reports and published articles, and he found very few student reports contained personal pronouns associated with explicit cognitive verbs, such as think, believe, and assume. So previously, EAP studies are largely or mainly concerned with the differences of discursive practice between novice and expert writers in terms of a broad knowledge fields, hard and soft disciplines, or hard and soft sciences. So they don't pay much attention to the likely divergence within a disciplinary divide, like the differences within a disciplinary divide, like within hard sciences or within soft sciences. They just discussed the differences between students and expert writers in terms of a very broad knowledge field. So in this study, we look at students of academic stance given by students and expert writers, and we use the term positioning as a way to situate writers and possibilities for authorial projection in social interaction in terms of emotion and epistemic commitment to knowledge and associated discursive practice. So in this study, we use positioning rather than stance because we think this term is better one to help us to see how writers socially construct, socially contextualize their self-projection, self-expectations, and parts what they are discussing in their text. And Professor Helen and I have shown in our diachronic study that attitudinal markers showed a decrease in use, but epistemic markers are increased over the years, over the recent 50 years. So in this study, we focalized epistemic positioning, the writer's positioning towards the certainty of knowledge, the status of knowledge. So this is the focus of our linguistic analysis. We use epistemic positioning. And epistemic positioning has a very direct and important connections with hedges and boosters. So hedges and boosters are, I think, are quite known to everyone online because you are interested in academic discourse. Hedges are devices that indicate the writer's decision to withhold complete commitment to a proposition, allowing the writer to open up dialogue space and the possibility for negotiation with the readers. So writers use hedges to present the propositions as opinions rather than facts, thus offer a negotiable dialogue with readers. So example devices of hedges are like may, could, perhaps, likely, these linguistic terms. Boosters, on the other hand, are the opposite of hedges. We say there are two sides of the same coin in the construction of social interaction. And boosters like should, must, obviously, of course, these linguistic items, these linguistic markers. So boosters express certainty, signaling the writer's decision to assert claims with strong commitment and shut down different voices to reject different views. So it's very strong voice given by writers in the presentation of disciplinary knowledge. So in this study, we try to compare the epistemic positioning, hedges, and boosters used by student and expert writers in 4 different science disciplines. In specific, we also want to ask the following questions. What are the similarities and differences of epistemic positioning? between science PhD students and expert writers in pure and applied disciplines? To what extent do PhD students differ from professional writers in the use of hedges and boosters across different sections of research papers, like introduction, method, results, and the concluded sections of research papers? And we also look at what the differences are, if any, in the linguistic forms of epistemic positioning by PhD students and professional writers. And in order to answer these questions, we built two corpora, the PhD student writer corpus, ESW, here we can see in table 1, and expert corpus, EW. The student corpus consists of 160 research papers produced by PhD students on an academic writing course in Tsinghua University in Beijing. And the course aims to improve the students' competence of writing English for research and publication purposes. The students come from 4 scientific fields, material science, computer science, physics, and life science. These 4 disciplines broadly represent distinct intellectual clusters in terms of the nature of their subject matters, whereby physics and life science are hard pure disciplines, and material and computer science are hard applied ones. And we are also aware of the trend of collaborative research and co-authorship in science writing. So the course was designed to ask 2 students to pair up for the same research and to write their research papers together on a proposed experiment as course assignments. So the papers produced by students were based on students' experimental data and were composed with the intention of international publishing. And in the corpus, in the expert corpus, 2 journals were selected in each discipline according to a 5-year impact factor in 2017, and 20 co-authored articles were randomly chosen from each journal. And we're also aware of the likely influence of L1 background on stats taking. So we try to choose those research articles which are written by Anglophone writers. So we look at the author information of each paper, and we refer to their surnames and affiliations for our decisions, whether they are Anglophone writers or not. And the 2 corpora are summarized in table 1. And then we draw on Highland and Lancaster papers for a list of about 140 hedging and boosting markers, which are potentially used by students and expert writers, because in Professor Highland's paper, all the items he gave are mainly used by expert writers like journal articles, but items given by and Lancasters are those that are used by students in their academic text. So we just try to compare or combine these items in a exhaustive search of items used by students and expert writers. And we look for these items in our corpus by using anaconc. And we also manually check each concordance lines with a reference to a wider context to ensure that the items we identified by anaconc are performing an epistemic positioning function. So we use both kind of automatic and manual checking method in our search of these items. Now let's look at what we found from the study, from the data analysis. We identified 19,922 cases of epistemic positioning in the corpora of student and expert writers, averaging 58.5 cases per paper. While students use fewer positioning markers than expert writers, the difference is not statistically significant. So the close high frequency in epistemic markers used by students and expert writers show us that both writers are aware of kind of the way they should step into text. So the high frequency reveals the interactional characteristic of academic prose and indicates the awareness of both group of writers of projecting personal voice and strengthening academic persuasion in the construction of scientific knowledge. But when we take a close look at the overall distribution across disciplinary writer groups, we found very interesting differences, as we can see in table 2. And this table, we can see that the difference in applied disciplines exhibits statistical significance with the epistemic markers used less frequently in student texts than in research articles. So the left 2 columns shows the statistical results to see whether differences is significant or not. And in contrast, the writer groups in pure disciplines show no significant differences. We think this points to the need to further tap into a traditional broad divide between soft and hard disciplines, as we mentioned at the beginning, because previous studies were mainly concerned with such a broad divide. They don't look at subtle disciplinary differences. So we think we need to go further into the disciplinary difference when we consider the difference between students and expert writers' writing practice. So it may not be possible to draw conclusions on the rhetorical insufficiency of novice writers simply by a broad divide of knowledge fields, because to focus on a single discipline may blind us to the broad alignment of students' discursive practice with community expectation. As we can see here, a disciplinary comparison informs a better understanding of how students' writing diverges from professional text. So we need to go into further subtle differences across disciplines. We should not only consider a broad knowledge fields. And in addition, we also see the significant difference in hard applied disciplines as a likely consequence of PhD students' less adequate use of rhetorical means to explicitly construct an argument of pragmatism. Perry notes earlier that knowledge claims in applied sciences accrue value with a practical rather than theoretical orientation, and so they are strengthened by an explanatory qualification about how much the existing but competing paradigms are applicable to social problems. However, the persuasive engagement seems less compelling in pure sciences, where arguments are mainly analytical and seldom justified for real-world application. And we may get a taste of the overt and strong stance in applied sciences by the first 2 examples in this slide. And we may also can have a taste of the differences between students' test and expert test when we look at the 4 examples, compare the first 2 examples with the rest of 2 examples produced by students. We can see how heavily expert writers invest epistemic markers in their text to try to strengthen the persuasive force of their text, try to persuade writers to see the value, the application value of their knowledge claims, of their research finding. And we also look at the differences which we have mentioned in applied sciences. So we look at a detailed differences in applied sciences, and we examined the broader distribution of epistemic positioning across generic sections in the 4 corpora. As we mentioned, introduction, method, result, and conclusion. We look at why there are so many differences between students and expert writers. We look at which section do students and expert writers use these markers more frequently than the other part. So we look at the distribution of epistemic markers across the sections of research articles. And it is interesting to find that the differences mainly appear in the results and the discussion and the conclusion sections, as we can see in the first two concordance plots, which are taken from expert writers' texts. We can see here that expert writers try to invest most of the epistemic evaluation in the later sections of academic prose to comment on what they have found from their study. This interactional investment seems essential because scientific writings are not self-evident, so they have to be explicitly interpreted in terms of what they mean and what suggest and what they mean and what they suggest to readers. Plot 3 and 4 are taken from student texts, which are very typical of student text. So we can see here in student text, students are less likely to place emphasis on the interpretation of research findings. And this results, we think, aligns with Jiang's move analysis observation that expert researchers, expert writers offered more expectations of research findings to progressively widen the scope of their findings to broaden scientific communities, while novice researchers paid more attention to reporting results. So students in this corpus are more concerned with reporting their results, and they give more emphasis on rhetorical work at the beginning of their text. And we also think this is pedagogically influenced because students in EAP writing class or in EAP instruction are more aware of the course model proposed by John Swales. Maybe you have known course model, creating a research space. So teachers really heavily draw on Swales' course model in their teaching. So they try to strengthen students' awareness of building rhetorical persuasion at the beginning of a research article, how to create a research space at the beginning of the text. And we can see students use markers at the outside of the text in the following two examples. So they are more concerned with the persuasive underpinning in the introduction section of the research papers. So this is quite difference between students and expert writers. That's why students and expert writers in applied sciences show so remarkable differences in the use of epistemic markers in their text. And now let's look at hedges and boosters respectively. Hedges, as we have mentioned, represent a weakening of knowledge claim through an explicit quantification of a writer's commitment, showing the writer's uncertainty and also the desire to convey difference and respect for colleagues' views. So hedges also allow a writer to reckon what weight they should give to an assertion regarding the prism of disciplinary assumptions, communicating the claim from the epistemic perspectives of the writer's particular disciplinary community on what counts as knowledge. However, as we can see in Table 3, PhD students generally use fewer hedges than expert writers, although they presented a larger number in life science. Natural scientists typically see as their goal to subject the scientific knowledge they produce to the rigor of falsifiability. So they tend to either strengthen resolutive precision by filling out the measuring range in experiments or warrant the implication of research finding by marking statements as provisional, as we can see in these examples. That's how expert writers in natural sciences to use hedges to open up the space of their personal interpretation to allow writers to comment on their knowledge claims. And the lower frequency, as we have mentioned, the lower frequency of hedges used in students' texts in material science, computer science, and physics indicates that the rhetorical practice in the persuasive construction of scientific knowledge in these disciplines are more challenging to the novice students. And it is also interesting to note that different from expert writers, a large portion of hedges used by students to comment on the range of data, as we can see in examples 11 and 12, rather than the force of a proposition, as we can see in the previous slide. So these examples are taken from expert texts. So in expert writing, experts tend to use hedges to comment on the range of arguments they make based on their results, but students tend to use hedges to comment on the data rather than proposition, like estimated about. So students tend to comment on data rather than a proposition. So it's a numerical use of hedges rather than a propositional use of hedges. So this is quite interesting difference between students and expert writers. And it is also interesting to see in life science, hedges are more frequently used in students' texts rather than in expert texts. We think this may have something to do with the influence of the disciplinary norms of knowledge production. Such a discipline involving life and the organism typically reduces the reliance on interpreted truth in its modern shape than in early days. And it is also shown that undue uncertainty words have a negative impact on the citation in life science. So successful writing in life science counts on a restrained use of hedging features. So we may think students' heavy use of hedges in life science may not appropriate, as we can see in these two examples, which are taken from student texts. So this heavy use of hedges may not appropriate because we can mention that in life science, successful writings may not rely on too much use of hedging features, because use of too much hedges may have a bad impression, have bad influence on the use of recent articles in this discipline, life-related discipline. And we also grouped the grammatical categories of epistemic positioning into adjectives, models, adverbs, nouns, and we found very interesting proportional differences of the categories between the writer groups, as we can see in table 4. So in both two groups of writers, lexical verbs are the least used in the corpus. In the corpora. In student text, students make very heavy reliance on modal verbs, but expert writers make quite a balanced use of different grammatical categories. And we also found different linguistic choices between students and expert writers. So may, could, about, mainly, and possible are the 5 most frequent word choices in student corpora. And may, could, possible, likely, and indicate are the most commonly used in expert corpora. And we can also see here about and mainly are very frequently used in students' corpus. I'm not sure if you have familiar with the literature. Mainly is very heavily used by Chinese students. Maybe this is to do with something. Maybe this has something to do with the Chinese students' understanding of how they gave their stance in academic writing. So here, students relied on the adverb about and mainly very, very often. And this is perhaps because what student writers tend to hedge is numerical information, as we have mentioned above. So they use about very often because they always comment on numerical information. So they use about very frequently. And together with a common reporting behavior of students to limit the applicability of what is being discussed by using many in their text. So that's why we mentioned Chinese students always use many in their academic text. So they try to limit the applicability of what they have said in the text by using many. Now let's turn to booster. Boosters mark the conviction and confidence a writer wishes to attach to his or her proposition and represent a strong assertion about a state of affairs while shutting down different viewpoints. So boosters allow writers to present their work with assurance while effecting interpersonal solidarity, setting up the caution and self-effacement suggested by hedges against the assertion and involvement. However, as we can see in Table 5, material and computer science students utilize a smaller number of boosting features, boosting items than expert writers, and the less frequent use of boosters may not present the statement as warranted and convincing in terms of the assessment of reliability of the reliability they carry. So in these two disciplines, students make less use of boosters, so they may reduce the persuasive force of their text in applied sciences. Applied science disciplines with a strong application orientation, as we have mentioned, are now seeing an increasing need to address audience beyond an immediate group of informed insiders to promote both their research and oneself with external funders and commercial sponsors. And in addition, greater pressure and fierce competition clearly exists among academics to publish and reach a wider readership across the globe. So boosters here can help these applied scientists to raise the confidence about what is found and underline the strengths of research finding in the two, as we can see in the two examples. So crafting text in this way can offer a self-assured evaluation of results and proposition and persuades readers of the academic and academic and application value of the knowledge claims. And in these applied disciplines, readers are getting more and more diverse because in these applied scientific disciplines, writers try to promote their research to a heterogeneous readership, heterogeneous audience. As I mentioned many times, I met a guy in Hong Kong U who is a PhD roommate of mine at Hong Kong U, and he studied electronic engineering. Like he looked at and designed some kind of antenna for cell phones. He told me that after he had published a paper with the design of a new kind of antenna, he and his supervisor went to Shenzhen to promote the design, the new designed antenna to some small cell phone firms. If the boss was interested in their design, the boss will bought their design as a patent and then produce the antenna themselves. So in these applied sciences, readers are getting more and more diverse, maybe include the commercial funders or commercial stakeholders in government, in business world, whatever. So these applied scientists try to use boosters to reinforce the persuasiveness of their text, as we can see in these examples, certainly clearly shown and demonstrate. So these boosters can help writers to strengthen their knowledge claims based on what they have discussed in their scientific analysis. And back to grammatical categories of boosters, it is interesting to see they contrast remarkably with those hedging devices, but exhibit the same pattern in student and expert corpora. As we can see in Table 6, the most frequent form of boosters in both corpora is lexical verbs, which strengthen the assertiveness of variety of research findings. Epistemic adjectives, nouns, and adverbs are also commonly used, accounting for roughly 1/3 of the total to convey the writer's judgment with full commitment on propositional information. Modal verbs comprise the least preferred option by both groups of writers, although relatively preferred as a certain expression, as we can see in this table. And if we turn to the word choices of boosters in both corpora, we can see find and show most frequently used by both groups of writers. And this aligns with Professor Hanen's argument that authors in hard disciplines normally build scientific facts on experiments and observations. Thus, they try to subject their knowledge building to empirically oriented analysis rather than personal reasoning. So maybe that's why find and show are most frequently used by both group of writers. And we also found demonstrate and believe are also frequently used by expert writers, and this contrasts with students' choice of typical and obvious as their common choices when they use boosters in their text. So let's wrap it up. The view that academic writing is not dry and impersonal is now well established. And we are also familiar with the claim that textual interaction in academic discourse varies across soft and hard disciplinary domains, and much differs between novice and expert writers. And the way that EAP pedagogy improves student writing for academic purposes is informed by this knowledge of the discipline of the specific language features, discourse practices, and communicative skills of target academic groups. In this study, however, we have seen a more complex disciplinary divide between the PhD student and expert writers in the expression of epistemic positioning. And we have seen in the study that in applied sciences, the students show significant difference from expert writers using far less markers of epistemic positioning, but the disparity between students and expert writers becomes inconsiderable in pure sciences. So we believe this divide is not a monolithic divergence, but it has extended what we have known about the gap between novice and expert writers. It is more difficult to explain than to describe the differences, but we can hardly overlook the role of the publication process in shaping writers' choices of epistemic positioning, because in the expert corpus, we use the journal articles. These articles have gone through editing and reviewing processes, and there are a lot of studies given by those scholars who look at ERPP practice. They found that journal articles normally undergo the arduous process of editing and review process and academic publishing, and writers try to respond to the concerns of reviewers. So they try to show a very refined projection of academic stance. And in Englander's study back in 2006, she found that writers try to increase the use of hedges across the drafting process from first draft to the next revision until the published version. So the hedges are increased. So maybe that's why we see more hedges used by these applied scientists in the journal articles, because these texts, published texts, have gone through the whole process of reviewing, editing, and publishing these processes. And we should not also overlook the L1 cultural differences, as these L1 cultural differences have a likely influence on writers' preference for rhetorical choices. So many studies have shown that Confucian cultural beliefs behind the Chinese language typically regard truth and knowledge as self-evident and encourage the framing of ideas in a non-polemical fashion. As we can see in the studies of Hu and Cao and Xu and Nancy, Chinese writers tend to use fewer hedges, but more boosters than Anglophone writers. So this confusion of cultural beliefs really impacts on the way Chinese people use language in the writing or in the oral communication. Like in everyday teaching practice, so Chinese teachers, like in mainland contexts, teachers try to impart knowledge on students, so they seldom open up a dialogue with students. So in their belief, knowledge is kind of self-evident. So they try to frame ideas in a non-polemical fashion. Thus, we see the divergence of discursive practice by the by the science students and experts as sensitive to the different rhetorical imperative which act on the manufacture of academic knowledge and disciplinary persuasion. And we think the divide between novice and expert writers we identified in this study not only presents a disciplinary intricacy, but also feeds into the teaching of our academic writing in our EAP classrooms. So we think teachers should not regard students' use of epistemic resources available as invariably less adequate than professionals. So the teachers should sensitize students to the discursive practice in applied disciplines of either appealing to a less predictable readership or orienting research output to real-world application. And teachers are also supposed to present the functions and linguistic forms of evaluative expressions, show to students differences in the use of these markers by novice and expert writers. So teachers may also need to illustrate to students the rhetorical sections in which the epistemic resources are heavily used by ex-writers. So in this way, students may know they also need to invest rhetorical markers in rhetorical work in the later section of research articles. So teachers are also supposed to identify the diversity of epistemic positioning in disciplinary writing and encourage students to engage analytically with its rhetorical and develop a critical understanding of the context in which the rhetorical resources are used. And students then are allowed the access to the interactional means to achieve the particular communicative purpose and shape an appropriate authority identity. And as we have mentioned, this is one of the goals of our EAP instruction to support this process and bridge the gap of discursive practice between students and expert writers. And that's what I want to share with all of you today. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Danny, and thank you so much for everyone online for attention. Thank you.